And good morning, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us today as we chat with Pete Earley, who's the author of Crazy, A Father's Search Through America's Mental Health Madness, among other things. And I'll introduce Pete to you in just a minute. But there's always new folks joining these programs, and for those who've heard this talk before, I appreciate your bearing with me. But for those who are interested in CEUs, since this is a Department of Mental Health sponsored program here in Missouri, if you work for the Department of Mental Health or one of the provider agencies, use the special link for the CEUs that are for the DMH and providers. Everyone else, please use the CEU link underneath the video window. That is the ordinary CEU link. We've also put a link up there to Pete's website, so if you're interested in chatting with him, seeing his blog, looking through any of the various titles of books that he's got out there, the link to his website is underneath the video window as well. If at any point you have questions or comments, any kind of feedback during today's program, there is an email questions for speaker link also underneath the video window. You use that, you submit your comments to us, and we'll submit the comments and questions to Pete on your behalf at the end of his presentation. And so I'd like to introduce Pete Earley. I've got a bio sketch on him that we've gone through once before, but I had the chance to chat with Pete yesterday for a little while and to have dinner with him. And I think what you're going to find is a man who's very passionate about what he has to say. He's written a lot of books. He's a journalist. He worked for the Washington Post. So he's a very credible author. Most of his books, though, are from topics that are not so personal as the one that he's going to talk about today. And I think that that's the journey that he's going to take us on, and I think it's a very significant journey. And so while I'd like to introduce Pete Earley, the journalist, and Pete Earley, the author, I think what I'd like most to do is introduce you to Mike's dad, Pete Earley. The floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Tom. I'm really honored to be here, especially in this building. Tom gave me a tour yesterday and took me down the basement. I hope you don't get in trouble for that. And showed me where people who were considered to be lunatics were kept in these horrid conditions. And, it breaks your heart. The good news is how far we've come. And the challenge is how far we still have to go. I'd like to talk to you today about my story and add my face to the many faces of mental illness. And my story begins with a frantic car ride and my son saying these words, "Dad, how would you feel if someone you loved killed himself?" My college-age son and Mike were racing down Interstate 95, traveling from Manhattan to Fairfax County, Virginia, where I live, when he asked me that question. Mike had been diagnosed a year earlier with a mental illness, bipolar disorder, and a psychiatrist had prescribed him medication, but my son had stopped taking his pills, and during that 4-hour car ride, Mike would laugh one minute and then begin sobbing the next. And I pleaded with him to take his medication. And he screamed at me, "Leave me alone. Pills are poison." And we got to the Fairfax County Hospital and in the emergency room, and the nurse rolled her eyes while Mike talked gibberish about this secret special mission that God had him on. And then we were taken to a waiting room, which is exactly what we did for the next 4 hours. And finally Mike said, "I've had enough. I'm going to leave. I'm going to get out of here." I said, hold on. And I raced outside and I flagged down a doctor, and I will never forget how that doctor came into the room. He came in with his hands up as if he was surrendering, and he said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Earley, I can't help your son." I said, "You haven't even examined him." And he explained to me that it didn't matter. The Virginia law was very specific. Unless a person posed an imminent danger, either themselves or someone else, they could not be required to take medication or undergo treatment. And the nurse had warned the doctor that my son thought all pills were poison. So then the doctor turned to me and he said, "Mr. Earley, bring your son back after he tries to kill you or he tries to kill someone else." I took my son home, and during the next 48 hours, he sunk deeper and deeper into a mental abyss. At one point, he had tinfoil wrapped on his head to keep the CIA from reading his thoughts through the television. He slipped out of my house early one morning. He slipped out and he broke into a stranger's house. Luckily, they were not at home. He broke in to take a bubble bath, and it took 4 police officers to get him out of that house. And when they did, they took him to a community treatment center, and I raced over. And a policeman was standing outside, and he says, "Mr. Earley, before you go in, let me give you some friendly advice. Even though your son has told us he has a mental health diagnosis, even though he's told us he's off his medication, even though we picked him up in a house he'd broken into to take a bubble bath, unless you go inside and you tell that psychiatrist inside that your son has threatened to kill you, he will not meet Virginia's imminent danger criteria." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, my son hasn't threatened to kill me." And he shrugged and said, "Okay," and walked away. So I'm here to tell you today with no great pride, because it hurt my relationship with my son. But I went in and I lied. I said my son had threatened to kill me, and that was good enough to get him taken to a hospital where 24 hours later he voluntarily committed himself. But our problems were far from over. 24 hours after he had voluntarily committed himself, his doctor called me. He said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Earley, but the insurance company is insisting that your son be released because they don't consider him a danger. He doesn't need to be in the hospital." And I called that insurance company, but I got absolutely nowhere until I happened to mention that I used to work at the Washington Post, and I happened to mention that I was a good friend of Mike Wallace of CBS 60 Minutes fame. I had Mike call that hospital, and suddenly a bed was open for my son for a record-breaking 14 days. But our problems were far from over. Right in the middle of his treatment, I received a call from the Fairfax County Police. My son was being charged with 2 felonies, breaking and entering and destruction of property. I was so frustrated. Virginia law had kept me from getting him help when he needed it. Now I wanted to punish him for a crime he'd committed when he wasn't thinking clearly. I just feel so helpless, I told my wife Patty one night. I want to help our son, but I don't know what to do. "Then do what you do best," she said. "Pete Earley, a father, can't find out much, but Pete Earley, a reporter, can. Investigate this and try to find out what in the world is going on with mental health today." So I did a little digging, I did a little investigation, and I discovered that what happened to my son Mike was not some aberration. It wasn't some freak occurrence. Right now, as I'm talking to you from St. Louis, there are more than 300,000 people with bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and major depression sitting in jails and prisons. 500,000 are on probation. More than a million go through the criminal justice system every year. And as many of you know as professionals, the largest public mental health facility in the United States today is not a hospital. It is not a treatment center. It's the Los Angeles County Jail. Well, those statistics gave me an idea. But first I wanted to talk to my son Mike about it. I said, "Mike, I'm thinking about writing a book about what happened to you." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, who would want to read that?" And I said, "No, son, I'm going to take your story. And then I'm going to find a jail somewhere far away from Fairfax County because I don't want to run the risk of irritating a judge or a prosecutor handling your case. And I'm going to find that jail and I'm going to go in and I'm going to find people who are clearly there because they have a mental illness. And then I'm going to follow them out through the system onto the street to see what really happens to them. And then I'll come back and I'll talk to the judges and the police and the prosecutors and the defense attorneys and the mental health workers and the parents and the consumers, and I'll try to make sense of it." "Dad," he said, "if it helps someone else, please tell my story." Well, I began at Los Angeles County Jail. Makes sense, largest public mental facility in the United States. I lasted 2 days before they threw me out, citing HIPAA violations. I tried Chicago next. They said no. I tried Rikers Island next. They said no. I tried Baltimore next. They said no. I tried Washington, D.C., my hometown. And they literally said, hell no. The only way I got in was because of a judge. He wants to be called a reform-minded judge, not an activist judge, in Miami, Judge Steve Leifman. He said, "Come here and I'll get you in the jail." And I went down there, and I remember going to the Miami Dade County Pre-Detention Center for the first time, and going on the 9th floor where the persons with mental illnesses were kept, and going to C Wing, which is the suicide wing. There are 19 cells in C Wing. It's a U-shaped cell block. All the cells have plexiglass fronts. The officers walk up and down the center, keeping a look on the inmates inside. And when I walked in there, the air stunk, and the cell, it was heavy. And I walked in and I looked in those cells, and I saw men completely naked in cells that had nothing else in them. And because of a design flaw, because of the plexiglass in the front of the jail cells, all the cold air filtered into the cells. It was bone-chilling cold, but there were no blankets. And because it was an old facility, the water system often didn't work. And therefore, people were drinking out of the toilets because there was no water. I remember standing there and hearing a sound. Thud, thud, thud. Then faster. Thud, thud, thud. Then louder. Thud, thud, thud. It was one of the inmates rushing forward, smashing his forehead into the front of the plexiglass. "I ain't crazy," he screamed. "Then stop acting like you are," one of the unconcerned correctional officers replied. Now, when I spent time there, I spent 9 to 10 months there, I found out that the officers called this the forgotten floor. And I thought they were talking about the people who were being held there, but they also were talking about themselves. Not one of these officers had received any kind of any kind of training to deal with persons with mental illness. And when I got to know them better, I discovered that every one of them thought they had been assigned to work with the crazies as punishment because they were troublesome employees and their bosses wanted them to have a job that would make them quit. My tour guide was Dr. Joseph Portier, a fabulous psychiatrist with an impossible job. A lot of people think, he told me, that you will get help if you get put in a jail. We can't help people here. We're a jail. We're not a hospital. I went with Dr. Portier on his morning rounds. That morning there were 92 inmates in the high security area. His rounds took us the equivalent of spending 12.5 seconds with each inmate. 12.5 seconds. That's as long as we spent with each inmate. I want to tell you this morning about 3 of the inmates that I got to know well. The first is Alice Ann Collier. She had schizophrenia. She had been institutionalized, then released to the streets. She was homeless. She lived in South Beach in a cardboard box 2x4 constructed little hut behind a restaurant. And this time she was arrested because she was walking down the street and she went by a bus stop. And an elderly woman was standing there and their eyes locked. And Alice Ann screamed, "Stop stealing my thoughts." And she raced up and she shoved the older woman. Not hard enough to knock her over, but she shoved her. And then she ran off. And well-meaning witnesses came up and said, "Get her arrested. Get her picked up off the street. They'll do something. They'll help her." Well, she got picked up, but help is not what she got. Now, Florida takes its crimes against the elderly very seriously. So many people retire their elderly, so these are considered automatic felonies, any crime against a person who is elderly. And because Alice Ann had shoved 2 other elderly women at bus stops, she was charged under the state's 3 strikes law, which meant she faced a mandatory, non-negotiable 5 years in prison. But when she was taken before the judge, he looked down and he said, "I can't put this woman on trial. She clearly doesn't understand what's going on. She has a mental illness. I'm going to send her to the state hospital at Chattahoochee to be made competent." Not treated, made competent. And there's a difference. Treatment means you get help. Well, that's not what happened with Alice Ann. Every day she was taken into a room and she was shown 3 chairs. On one chair was written the word judge, on the next one prosecutor, the third one defense attorney. And when Alice Ann could tell her keepers who sat in each chair, she was deemed competent enough to be put on trial. So she was brought back to the court. Of course, she wasn't. She still had a severe mental illness. And the judge looked down at her and he said, "What is going on? I sent this woman away to be made competent. Send her back to Chattahoochee. So back she went. When I found Alice Ann Collier, she had been traveling between the jail and Chattahoochee 1,151 days, more than 3 years, and she still had never been brought to trial. Now, I'm a reporter. I took out my little pen and paper. I wrote it all down. I went rushing over to the prosecutor's office. And they told me with no embarrassment, no hint of shame, that they knew exactly what they were doing with Alice Ann Collier. They were keeping her on that bus, intentionally sending her back and forth, back and forth. Why? Because she was dangerous. Medication didn't seem to help her. And there was no safe place. There was no safe place in the entire state of Florida. No treatment centers, no long-term facilities where they could put her and have her receive any kind of care. So they were sending her back and forth on that bus. Now, she was typical of the kind of inmates I was following. These were not Hannibal Lecter serial killers. They were people with bipolar disorder and depression and schizophrenia. Now, according to the National Institutes of Mental Health, 70% of persons with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia and major depression can be helped by medication, and the recovery rate can go even higher when you add other services, important services like jobs and housing and community acceptance. But first, you have to find a way to get people into treatment, and then you have to have programs available. Consider April Hernandez. She was the same age as my son when I found her, and when I found her in jail, she was serving time for stealing a car. And when I investigated the case, I discovered that she'd been framed. Who had framed her? Her own parents. Now, why would your own parents frame your daughter and get her put in jail on a car theft charge? Because April was psychotic, she was homeless, she was living on the streets of South Beach, where she had been gang raped twice and attacked 3 times by teenagers on weekends who thought it was hilarious to attack homeless people, and there was nothing anyone could do because she didn't pose an imminent danger to herself or anyone else. Now, the third person I want to talk to you about, all of us, I don't care who you are, know somebody like Freddy Gilbert. A Miami study found that in any given time in a population of 2 million, there were 1,500 people who were living on the streets, sleeping in cars, sleeping in parks. They were homeless. But that same study found of those 1,500 persons, most were able to move through the system and find some kind of supportive housing, except for 405 individuals. Those 405 individuals, often are called frequent flyers, are the chronic homeless. And Freddy was one of them. When I met Freddy in the jail, he was so sick he could not speak. He stood naked in his cell and he grunted like an animal, and the correctional guards controlled him by offering him sandwiches as if he were a dog performing for treats. And when I checked his record, I discovered that Freddy Gilbert, in just the last 2 years, had been in and out of that jail more than 14 times and had never gotten any kind of help for his mental illness. This is because he was charged with misdemeanors, and under Florida law, misdemeanors did not qualify to get him into any kind of program. How in the world did we get into this situation? Well, we've really come full circle. In colonial days, people with mental illnesses had to depend on their families, or they were locked in jail, or they were taken to the county line and warned out, which meant the sheriff said, start walking and never come back. And many of you know our history. 1843, Dorothea Dix is going to teach a Bible class in Boston in the jail, and she goes through a part of the jail, and she discovers there's no heat. And she goes to the jailer and she says, it's freezing outside. You have people in these cells and there's no heat. And he looks at her and he says, oh, those are the lunatics. They're not like us. They don't feel the cold. They don't need heat. Well, Dorothea Dix spent the next 2 decades arguing that persons with mental illnesses needed treatment, needed care, not punishment. And she personally persuaded 33 states to open up hospitals for treating persons with mental disorders. Well, we all know what happened next. During the next 50 years, many of these hospitals became giant warehouses, horrific places where people were locked up and forgotten. In my home state of Oklahoma, in the 1960s, which wasn't that long ago for some of us, a reporter did a series and compared the state hospitals in Oklahoma to being worse than Nazi concentration camps. Well, John F. Kennedy heard the cries for reform in 1963. He called on Congress to put aside $3 billion, sounds like chump change now, $3 billion, and to spend moving people into community-based treatment centers. The discovery of a new drug called Thorazine seemed to make it possible to move people out of these institutions and back into their communities. And Kennedy's plan called for the creation of 2,400 community mental health treatment centers. Well, what happened? Kennedy was assassinated. The Vietnam War escalated. Congress got ensnarled in Watergate. Thorazine turned out not to be as wonderful as everybody thought. Neighborhoods proved to be not as welcoming as they should have been. In short, that $3 billion never got spent as planned. Those 2,400 centers never got opened as scheduled. And what happened next? We had deinstitutionalization, a fabulous idea that soon turned into a cruel joke. And this is because we began closing down these state hospitals without having an adequate community safety net. And overnight, literally thousands and thousands of sick people were pushed out the front door on the street. Now, I was surprised when I investigated deinstitutionalization because I'd seen one flew over the cuckoo's nest, and probably like many of you, I thought this was done because of compassion, because of concern, because of how these people were being denied services in these hospitals. But it was not compassion, and it was not concern that led to the wholesale closing of state institutions. If you check your history books, you'll see that the driving force was money. Two big waves, and money was behind both of them. State legislators were being pushed into a corner. Civil rights groups were rallying and saying, you can't treat people like this. Newspapers were doing expose. The legislators were being told, you have to pay money to fix up these facilities. Treat these people right, or you're going to face lawsuits. And what happened? Uncle Sam came riding in on a white horse and said, don't worry, we'll take care of persons with mental illness. We'll qualify them for federal programs. We'll take care of them, but only if you get them out of those state institutions. And state legislators went, wow, fantastic. Let's let the feds deal with this problem, and shove the people out the door. Now, what else contributed here? We created a perfect storm. In 1980, we elected Ronald Reagan. And we came to Washington and we said, we're tired of these federal programs. Get Uncle Sam's hand out of our pocket. Cut programs. And he did. Look at housing alone. Under the Reagan administration, it went from $7 billion to $2 billion. In fact, he, in essence, began denying money to the very programs that we said we'd use to help people who had mental illnesses move into our communities. Even today, we still do not have, after millions of dollars, millions of new programs, we still do not have adequate community services in most of our communities. Let me give you an example. Let's return to Miami. Not everybody there with a mental illness is locked up in jail and prison. There are 4,500 people who have serious mental illnesses who live in assisted living facilities, ALFs, boarding homes. And that's fabulous. We got them out of these state hospitals. We got them in our communities. But let's look at those ALFs. 650 of them, 4,500 people, 400 of those 650 facilities are in such bad shape they can't pass the state's minimum standards for operating as boarding home. In other words, if you tried to put anyone but a person with mental illness in there, it would not be allowed. One of the ones I visited had a hole in the roof. Rain came through. Medications were scattered on a kitchen table. The caretaker only spoke Spanish. None of the tenants spoke Spanish. The meals were rice and beans. There was no therapy. There was no case management. There was nothing but idle days, smoking cigarettes, and watching TV. And I would argue in this case, we haven't improved these people's lives by taking them out of institutions and putting them in our communities. We're just hiding them better. Now, in addition to deinstitutionalization without adequate community resources, there's another reason why our jails and prisons are filling up with people whose only real crime is that they got sick. At the same time, we had the mental health movement. Lawyers said, hey, wait a minute. You shouldn't be arrested just because you have a mental illness. And that's right. Having a mental illness shouldn't be a crime. And they said, look, you shouldn't have somebody just pick you up and take you somewhere and put you in an institution and give you a lobotomy. You should have a right to demand certain kind of treatment or refuse treatment. And that was right. And most of all, and they made no effort to hide this, they targeted commitment laws on the theory that it was better to stop someone from being put in one of these state institutions than to force them in. Best to stop them. Better for them. And they tried to make the language as tough as possible, and they ended up with imminent danger. And one judge ruled that a man who had schizophrenia, chronic schizophrenia, sleeping under a car at night, did not meet the imminent danger criteria because neither of those acts was life-threatening. Now, I love my son, and I want his civil rights protected. And I know the horrible history of how we have treated people in our country who have mental illnesses. But I would argue imminent danger, focusing only on danger, does not do society or an ill person any good. We must find a better way to protect someone's civil rights, but also get them help before they become dangerous and enter our criminal justice system. Deinstitutionalization, inadequate community services, overly restrictive commitment laws. This is what I believe has caused us to reach the point where we are today. And what are we doing about it? We're turning mental illness from a health problem into a criminal justice problem. Right now, people are focusing on mental health courts, and we're focusing on jail diversion programs. And those are wonderful. I endorse them. They are fabulous. But we need to remember a lesson we should have learned with deinstitutionalization that we seem to have forgotten. Diverting someone from jail is wonderful if you have somewhere to divert them to. If you don't have community services, if you don't have ACT teams, if you don't have CIT, if you don't have peer-to-peer, if you don't have hospitals, state hospitals where people can be stable and then go back to the community, if you don't have those kind of resources, what good does it do to divert someone out into a community and abandon them? And that's where we're going today in our country. I recently spoke in Alabama, and before I spoke, one of their state's top people got up and spoke and said that if you had a mental illness in Alabama today, the best thing that could happen to you is you could get arrested because then you'd get good services. That's wrong. People say to me, oh, Pete, mental illness is so difficult. We'll never solve it. We never have been able to. There's really nothing we can do. And I look at them and I answer with one word, bull. And I cleaned that up since we're in a state building. Since I've written my book, I've been to 46 states. I've toured over 100 different treatment programs. I have seen fabulous things. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, I saw a jobs program patterned after Fountain House in New York, which has been around since the 40s, where, okay, Pete can't work a full 8 hours a day. So Pete goes and he works 2 or 3 hours, and then Sally comes and works. And that way I get a job. In San Antonio, Texas, you should look up their website, check out what they did. They created a drop-in center, not an emergency room, not the jail, a drop-in center where they can take persons who are in crisis and feed them into the treatment. And they have documented how that program, avoiding the emergency room, avoiding the jail, has saved them tax dollars. Okay? You look at Housing First, the LAMP in Los Angeles. Chronic people such as Freddy Gilbert, thought to be unrestorable, and they put them in an apartment while they're still sick, knowing they may have drug and alcohol problems. They put them in the apartment. An 86% success rate. Why? Because having a safe place to live is essential to recovery. People do get better. People can recover. I found a program in Miami that was doing the seemingly impossible. The program was called Passageway. And Passageway, get this, it was taking people with chronic schizophrenia who had committed violent crimes, including murder, and it was moving them out of the jails and prisons back in the community. Now how? How in the world is that possible? Well, at Passageway, because these people had committed serious crimes, they were required to take their medication. But doctors worked with them to find the right medication, not the cheapest medication. And then doctors did something really phenomenal there. They actually talked to their patients. You know, my son has had 9 different psychiatrists between emergency rooms, community treatment programs, private psychiatry. Only 2 of them, only 2 of those 9 have known anything but his name and his symptoms. And that is because they have been taught that these are organic chemical imbalances, and so the solution is just figuring out what pill to stick in someone's mouth. And they're under pressure from insurance companies to see somebody for 10 or 15 minutes and let social workers do the rest of it. But treating the mind also requires treating the heart. At Passageway, persons got to talk to their doctors, had them explain what was going on. At Passageway, everybody had a job. It didn't matter if it was wiping down a table or working 40 hours a week. Jobs give you a sense of satisfaction. All of us want a purpose in life. At Passageway, they had peer-to-peer. Why? Helping other people helps you feel better about yourself. They had excellent case management, which was phenomenal. They got housing, which was essential. But there was something else I discovered at Passageway, and I know some people think I'm Pollyanna for doing this, but I discovered the importance of community acceptance. The person who started Passageway, Tom Mullins, said to me, the secret of his program was amazingly simple. He had created a real asylum, not a place off in the boondocks somewhere where people were locked up and isolated, but a community where people were accepted and cared about each other. They weren't shunned, they weren't isolated, they weren't seen as freaks, and that made the difference. At Passageway, they had real asylum. I want to return to my son Mike. He received 2 years of probation, and he did great. He had a job. He became Employee of the Month. He was doing super. And as soon as his probation ended, he stopped taking his medication. I don't know why. We argued. We fought. Fairfax County has a mobile crisis response team. And I called it and I said, look, my son has stopped taking his medication. Here's what happened last time. And they said, wait a minute. You can't judge him on what happened last time. You can't punish him because of what happened last time. That doesn't matter. And I said, but he's slipping. I can see it. And they said, call us if he becomes dangerous. The night my son became dangerous, the night I didn't have to lie, the night he became violent, I called that same dispatcher. I said, my son is violent. Please come help us. And the dispatcher said, is he dangerous or is he violent? And I said, he's violent. And he said, we don't come then. You need to call the police. The police came, and my son Mike was shot twice with a taser, hogtied, and taken away. And I'm telling you that story for this reason. If I couldn't help my son after writing a book, spending 3 years investigating our mental health system, with all my political connections to the Washington Post and knowing people like Mike Wallace, with my money and with my education, what chance is someone in Missouri who has no education, has no money, has no political connections, what chance do they have getting into your system? That's the question you have to ask yourself. Mike had 2 more breakdowns since that night he was shot with the tasers. And I'm happy to report now, I'm very proud, that a month ago he finished peer-to-peer training and is now one of the people going into jails, helping people with mental illness come out and adjust to life. So I'm terribly, terribly proud of him. I'm going to end. I'm going to say something here. I'm going to tell a religious story. Before I do, I have to warn, I know you state employees and government, we got to be politically correct here coming out of Washington. I'm not endorsing religion and I'm not against religion. I just like this story, okay? I grew up in Oklahoma. My dad was a minister there. And I got, any of you who know about Oklahoma and ministers know what that means. It means I got dragged to church every Wednesday night and Saturday and twice on Sunday, okay? And I got really good at sitting there listening and not hearing a word. But there was always a story my dad told that snapped me to attention. And that's because the story's about a woman having sex, okay? They're in the Bible, you just got to know where to look. It's about a woman who's caught in adultery. It's always the women. She's dragged out in the middle of the town. People gather around. They're going to throw stones at her. They're going to kill her because of this horrible thing that she has done. And then the teacher says, "Let ye who has never sinned throw that very first stone." And according to the New Testament, people dropped the rocks and they walked away because everybody understood that we're all sinful. We all make mistakes. None of us are pure. Unfortunately, we live in a world today where people are eager to throw those rocks. They don't throw them down. They're eager to cast those stones at people who are different, people who don't fit in, people who are in jails and prisons, people with mental illness. They want to drive them away. They want to stone them. As persons who work for the Department of Mental Health, as people who are case managers, as people who care about persons with mental illness, I believe that you have chosen to become what I call a stone catcher, someone who steps between that angry mob and people who can't defend themselves until they can join you in defending others. And it's the stone catchers in our society who give me hope. So thank you. My son has a mental illness. To me, this cruel illness wears his face, and I will forever be grateful to people such as you who can look beyond the madness in his eyes and see a person of worth who has parents and brothers and sisters who love him. So thank you for listening to me. Thank you more for being a stone catcher. What you do changes lives. Thank you.
Thanks, Pete. And we're going to give people a chance to send in questions using the questions for speaker link. But since you told that religious-oriented story at the end, it's a good time for me to point out that next week's web conference on Wednesday the 3rd is called Mental Illness, Spirituality, and Faith.
There you
so
go.
I figured that was a good time to plug that program.
Yeah, it's good.
It's Craig Rennebaum.
I'll expect more money now.
There you go. We do have a question.
Great.
Gentleman writes in, he says, is there any movement by the legislature to create a guardianship limited to just medical care? It seems to me that being non-compliant with respect to medication would be enough to warrant such an action. I'm a consumer that has a dual diagnosis of major recurring depression and generalized anxiety disorder, and the thought of not taking my medication doesn't even enter my mind.
Well, I can't answer specific questions about what's going on in Missouri, but I can give you some general answers. And this is a really touchy issue among a lot of consumers. The number one thing I think that's being pushed nationally is an advance directive. An advance directive is filled out by a consumer. It says, for instance, my son says, I don't want to take a Haldol. Every time I've been given a Haldol, it's knocked me for a loop for 3 or 4 days. If I am psychotic, don't give me Haldol. It also says in there that my father can make decisions for me if I am considered to be psychotic. The problem with advance directives is a lot of people in hospitals don't know what they are, which is kind of funny because, well, it's not funny, it's kind of ironic because when you're dealing with someone in a coma or anything else, you should be familiar with these things. But the other problem is a lot of doctors and lawyers will then take the advance directive and they'll turn to the person who's psychotic and say, well, do you still want to follow this? And the person will say, well, no, because this is what happened with my son. And they go, well, sorry, he's just removed it. So, you have to look at your state, see what the advance directive law is. It's a good way for a consumer to say, okay, I understand that I might slip or have a problem, but if I do, here's what I want. I don't want to end up homeless on the street, so here's what I want. here's my game plan. The other thing, of course, which is the real lightning rod in the mental health movement, is Dr. Fuller Torrey's assisted outpatient treatment, forced medication, Kendra's law in New York. And what that law is basically says, Kendra Webdell was a young woman who was pushed in front of a speeding subway train by a man who had a long history of mental illness, been in and out of hospitals, and never gotten proper treatment. And so the state passed a law, Kendra's law, and it says this: if you have a history of mental illness, if you have a history of going off your medication, if you have a history of violence, those three criteria, and the state, New York, it has a certain period. It can't be 20 years ago. It has to be in a certain time frame. Then a judge can order you to be compliant with your medication. The problem with many of these laws is that how do you enforce it? And that's what makes people nervous. Is, okay, I'm not taking my medication. Are you going to put me in jail? And a lot of states have gotten by this by saying, no, but we will put you in a treatment program. And, a lot of consumers are anti-AOT. A lot are in favor of it. It's a hot button issue. The MacArthur Foundation did a study, an independent study, and it just recently released it. You can find it on the internet. And it found that AOT helped most of a huge percentage. I can't quote it exactly, but it turned out to be a very good thing for the consumers in the New York area. So that's another area to go. The problem with all these programs, Virginia has an AOT legislation. Nobody ever uses it. Why? Because if you don't have any room in a treatment center, you don't have anywhere to go. We have such a hospital bed shortage in this country. Fairfax County, where I live, in 2005, closed 25% of its hospital beds for psychiatric patients. Why? Because they're owned by HMOs. HMOs were supposed to be this wonderful thing to help us all get good medical treatment, but they have to watch the bottom line. Psychiatric beds don't make money. Surgical beds do. So the psychiatric beds are getting shut down left and right. We're closing down state hospital beds. The last time my son became psychotic, it took us 4 hours, even though he agreed to go into a hospital, to find a bed where we could get him in a hospital. That's part of the crisis.
What advice would you have for other parents who may be in your position?
Well, the first thing you need to know as a parent is whether your police, and I'm sorry, but I think in the negative here, whether your police department has crisis intervention training. Crisis intervention training, I know you have it here in Missouri, is special training for police officers to deal with persons with mental illness. You do not want Rambo coming through the door if you have somebody who has paranoid schizophrenia and already is terrified, okay? That's the first thing. The second thing is know your state commitment laws. And it's in Virginia is very interesting because I was on a panel that looked at state commitment laws, and what we discovered was we had a patchwork. In some counties, it was ridiculously low to get somebody committed. It literally was calling up Fred and saying, hey, Pete's acting a little goofy here. I want him committed. That was just outrageous. And where I lived, it was the extreme the other way. A couple months ago, we had a guy who was completely naked, walking around an apartment building, trying to open doors. He found one open in the middle of the night, opened it, walked in. Luckily, the people didn't shoot him. They called, the police came, they took him before a magistrate, and the magistrate said, he's not in imminent danger, even though he was clearly psychotic and naked. So they took him homeless shelter. He attacks someone, ends up in jail. And that is, to me, the other extreme, So as a parent, you want to learn. I always tell people, get involved in the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, or Mental Health America. Mental Health America is a consumer-driven organization started by a former patient who thought that institutions needed to be changed. NAMI was more of a parent group started because of frustrations by parents. They'll know the lay of the land. So you know which jurisdiction, what the rules are, what commitment, know what your rights are. And then welcome to a wilderness. The most helpful thing that I had a parent tell me was, first of all, don't expect you're going to make the right decision all the time because nobody knows what the right decision is. And second, you have to be willing to have your own child hate you in order to get them help. And that's horrible. I tend to get choked up when I talk about the parent role because It is so infuriating. I had a parent tell me, as actually a brother said to me, my sister has been mentally ill for more than 20 years. She's had a dozen doctors. She's had 24 social workers. But when the day is done, the person always comes back to me. And yet parents are often the first shown the door. You're part of the problem. We don't want your input. You're just trying to dump your kid into our problem. And it's very, very difficult for parents. So you have to hang in there. You have to be an advocate, and you have to be an effective advocate. And part of that is educating yourself about the laws, what you can. A final statement, then I'll get to the next question. For instance, HIPAA. Right. My son goes in the hospital and he says he's angry. I don't want my dad to know anything about my case. Fine. It's his right. He should have that right. That doesn't stop me from going to his doctor. And when the doctor says, I can't talk about your case, you go, yeah, you can't. I understand that. But here's my son's history. Here's what's happened in the past. You need to know this. You need to know that. You need to know this. And make them listen to you. Make them listen to you.
What is the correlation between homelessness and mental illness in the United States?
This is an interesting question because people disagree about the amount. And you have to quantify homelessness like the Miami study. A lot of homeless advocates do not want to talk about mental illness because they're afraid that will send out the stigma. I think the typical quoted statistic is 40%. I have spent the last 3 months in Georgetown following around homeless people. And what I have found is this. Every one of the men who are sleeping on the street at night in Georgetown have a mental illness and a co-occurring problem. Every one of them. Not 40%, every one of them. A lot of co-occurring problems, drug and alcohol. The ones who don't have a mental illness find a place to go, find a way to work through the system. So I think this is a great kind of hidden statistic. Now you got to also separate, as the Miami study did, temporary homelessness and chronic homelessness. If I don't find another book to do and can't make a living doing it, I can end. A lot of people are on the edge of homelessness, but most of us are able to work some way through it. Relatives, I'm really not on the edge of homelessness, but you understand my point. Anybody can become homeless, but we have the facilities to move through it. Persons with chronic mental illness who are confused, who are in mania, who are psychotic, who are using drugs and alcohol can't.
It's kind of a shift on the parent question here. She says, as public guardians, we are often asked by parents to be the guardian so that they don't get the blame for putting their children in facilities or making them get proper treatment. Are you the guardian for your son? What can we tell these parents that might help them to take this responsibility on?
Yeah. I am not the guardian for my son. My son is now 30 years old, and he certainly doesn't want me to be his guardian. And I've never investigated that angle of it. I am fortunate in that while my son has been through a lot with 4 breakdowns, medication works really well for him. And he's never ended up homeless on the streets or ended up in a position where I felt so compelled that I had to become a guardian and go through those steps. I would like to address, though, what that question, part of it. In Virginia, involuntary commitment, a relative or friend has to file it. And that person asked the question is exactly spot on. That sets you up in an adversarial position. And you are the enemy. Why are you doing this to me? And then if the hearing ends and the person is not committed, everybody leaves and you're standing there with your loved one and they're saying, I don't want to go home with you, or, you're the one who did this. And, that it's a dangerous situation. In Florida, with the Baker Act, it's a little different. The public defender's or protection and advocacy people defend the rights of the person who's going to be committed, because in Virginia, as everywhere else, you automatically get an attorney appointed for you. But rather than the parent, it's the prosecutor's office who makes the case. The problem we discovered in Miami was that the defender's office has a lot of people who really feel strongly about civil rights. They really care about this issue. They're going to make sure that that person gets the best representation, as they should. The prosecutor's office didn't. They wanted to be chasing drug dealers. They didn't. So the prosecutor would show up, and they were losing every case because they weren't well prepared. So you try to build things in, but you have to have I think it would be better to have, even though we found problems with it, more of a Baker Act approach, where you had somebody on your side so the parent could step back a little.
I know one of the things you do talk about is money, and I don't remember if you
Right.
touched on this particular aspect or not, but is it in fact more expensive or less expensive to take people out of the prison setting and find treatment in other ways?
Well, I think that's a really key point, Tom. You know, in the Miami jail, there are 1,200 people who have severe mental illnesses in that jail. They cost $100,000 per day. That is an outrageous amount of money to spend, and nobody's getting any better. For half that amount, I think it's $36 million, half that $18 million, you could give somebody an ACT team in housing and actually help them get better. This is part of the problem of our system today. We have a triage system. We depend on emergency rooms. We depend on jails and prisons, the most expensive ways to help people, rather than doing things like supportive housing, which cost money in the beginning, but in the long run will pay off. And one story I like to tell is about the unknown cost of mental illness in your community. The Washington Post did a study about who made 911 calls. And because we're so efficient in Washington, each 911 call costs about $700. The number one person who was making 911 calls had schizophrenia. He made over 250 calls in 1 year alone. He was lonely, wanted to ride somewhere. That is an unintended cost of mental illness, untreated mental illness in our community. I believe that we could save money by shifting mental health back into a health problem rather than a criminal justice. With statistics, most 16% severe mental illnesses, people in jails and prisons. That's a huge population, and they're not getting any better, and they shouldn't be there. And that's the key to me, is even though I think you could do a cost analysis. They did this in California. A guy named Rusty Seelix out there you can look up. And they looked at it, and he felt like if you implemented public or supportive housing ACT teams, that over a 10-year period, you'd eventually break even. But I argue, I don't care if it breaks even. If that's my son, I want him to get treatment. And that's the cost of living in a humane society. There's other ways to pay for this, by the way, too. In Virginia, I've been very popular by pushing for a tax on cigarettes. We have one of the lowest cigarette tax rates in the United States, 30 cents a pack. If we raised it a dime, we'd raise $100 million. $100 million. Why tie it to mental health? Because if you look on the internet, you'll find a UCLA study where 40% of cigarettes sold in the United States, 40% of cigarettes sold in the United States are bought by consumers. Self-medication. So it makes sense to tie those. Look for other revenue sources. I think it's New Jersey where they were actually using income from tickets, traffic tickets, to help fund. I think you all have mill levels here, so maybe you don't have that problem, but trying to get enough money to shift the system over.
All right. Well, I think we've exhausted everyone, including you.
Thank you.
Listen, we really appreciate your being
My
here and taking the
pleasure
time
being
to be
here.
here today. Folks, we thank you for your attention today. Thanks for participating in today's program. Like I said, our next program is, in fact, next week. Craig Rennebaum will be here here on Wednesday afternoon with a program on mental illness, spirituality, and faith. In the meantime, we'll leave the CEU links open for a little while and send them to you in an email following today's program, probably first thing in the morning. We'll get that out to you. And also a link to Pete's website so you can get more information on this book and his other writings. So again, we thank you for your time. And Pete, thanks for your time and your expertise today.
Thank you.